Take a network break. Help yourself to a virtual donut and join us for our weekly look at tech news. I'm Drew Conry Murray from the Packet Pushers.
And I'm Jonna Johnson from Nemerdes.
And we're sponsored today by Nokia. Its networking operating system, SR Linux, is built from the ground up to simplify data center operations and integrations while giving you the ultimate in visibility and flexibility. You can find out more about SR Linux for yourself at learn.srlinux.dev. And then stay tuned after the news. We have a Tech Bytes podcast sponsored by Palo Alto Networks. We're going to discuss vulnerability management for IoT and OT devices. These devices, so things like video cameras, sensors, medical equipment, industrial control systems, present unique challenges when it comes to finding, prioritizing, and managing software vulnerabilities. We'll talk about how Palo Alto Networks does it. John, we got a lot of news, so let's dive in, and I'm sure everybody's expecting this will be our lead story. It's CrowdStrike, a software update from the security vendor CrowdStrike caused Windows machines to go into a boot loop. Airports, hospitals, TV stations, and other entities around the world suffered significant business disruptions from the blue screen of death.
Well, and it's interesting, at the same time, there was a separate but unrelated Azure outage, which I think took a little longer to get restored. So it's been a very interesting weekend for both CrowdStrike and Microsoft. CrowdStrike says that the issue was a faulty channel file. The company issued an updated file, but everybody had to reboot their machines into safe mode, find the old one, or roll back to a snapshotted version. The fix was actually very clunky and kind of horrible. And rebooting multiple times eventually got you there, but you had to sit there. Can you imagine? You know, here you are, you're in an airport, and you're trying to reboot.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people had to actually go from machine to machine doing these manual reboots, I guess particularly for the desktop side, which, wow, what a mess.
It was. And amusingly enough, I was actually at an airport. I was at LAX when all of this happened. And, as I told you, I walked in, saw the blue screen of death everywhere and just started laughing. That was not taken well by the poor, agents who'd been there all night and were panicking, or by the customers that were freaking out. So, yes, I was chased away and told to stop that. But what really struck me on all of this, the view is divided whether it's CrowdStrike's fault or Microsoft's fault. The market seems to blame CrowdStrike more. They're down 11% the markets haven't opened yet on Monday as we record this, but Microsoft is only down 3.6%. So essentially the markets are saying CrowdStrike is 3 times as culpable. I am a little bit hesitant to go with that general perspective because you really should not be able to crash a machine with a bad update. That is an incredibly bad design in an operating system. That just should not be happening. And it's worth noting that, none of the other operating systems that got the update had any problems with it. People said, well, CrowdStrike should have tested this. Well, of course they tested it. They always test. What likely happened is, and this is a guess, this is pure speculation, but it's aligned with what Microsoft has done many times before. Microsoft likely made an undocumented change and everything went haywire because Microsoft has a long history of making undocumented changes, particularly to cybersecurity updates that cause things to not work quite right. We even talked about that on a previous episode.
Okay, so you think there was something behind the scenes that Microsoft did, and obviously it was a bad file from CrowdStrike because of the effects it had, but you think Microsoft actually did something to cause this file to have a problem?
I do, and I think there's 2 things going on. One is that Microsoft's failure mode is incredibly awful because you shouldn't go into the blue screen of death when you get a bad file. It just should reject the file. That's right. Fairly straightforward. That's what good operating systems do. As we all know, Windows is not a good operating system, which begs the question of why so many people are using it. But that's another conversation for another time. And then separately, my deep suspicion is that the root cause, not the proximate cause, the proximate cause was CrowdStrike injecting a bad file. But my deep suspicion is that the root cause is that Microsoft made an undocumented modification that caused the whole thing to go sideways.
This obviously also has implications for, sort of IT resiliency. Clearly, resiliency was not in effect here, given that so many people had so many issues and a lot of this repair work was manual. So any thoughts on what, IT leaders should be thinking about regarding resiliency going forward?
Well, as I've said before, and I know it's not a very popular point of view, I think it's well past the time when you should be questioning whether you put anything critical on Microsoft infrastructure at all. And I've said this in our advisories. I've told our clients this. The U.S. government is actually rethinking using Windows or Microsoft in general as a key platform. The concern that I've got is when you have a company that repeatedly has major outages like this or major issues. And when I say repeatedly, if you go look at the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, a significant percentage of the vulnerabilities are all tied to Windows, or not Windows, but Microsoft, all of the Microsoft products. Which, by the way, side note, this was actually the file actually had to do with Teams, which I don't know why anyone was running Teams, behind the scenes on an airline reservation system, because there's no need to be running Teams back there. But that's another issue. Teams has injected an enormous number of cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So, number one, if you haven't started rethinking your use of Microsoft, maybe you want to do that. I realize it's heresy. I realize it's the sacred cow, but maybe you should think about it. Second of all, I do want to say, and I want to at least give a shout out to the airline I happened to be flying, which was United, because once the fix was out, they were actually able to get us up and running, and my flight took off no more than about 3 hours late, which is tremendous if you think about going from a dead start.
Yep.
But yes, I think you need to have serious backup plans. And in fact, there was a very funny announcement by the gate agent who literally said, "I'm sorry, we're doing the best we can on our few Macs," which just made me laugh again. And I would also say more broadly, there's always been concerns about a monoculture in any environment.
Absolutely.
We all know that managing multiple operating systems is a pain for different reasons, but you may, for security reasons, want to rethink the whole concept of a monoculture generally, which might help you along your path of backing off from Microsoft without necessarily cutting the cord, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I feel like it seems like there's a lot of pressure from probably executives on IT organizations to be as lean and efficient as possible. And one of the ways you do that is by essentially a monoculture, because it's supposedly easier to manage. Like, you don't have to have different expertise across different platforms and all of the operational drag that comes with that. But again, this is what happens when you have a monoculture. When something goes wrong, it can go incredibly wrong across your entire infrastructure.
Exactly. And as we're about to discuss in a slightly different context, basically saying, well, we did this and everybody else did it too, so it should be okay. That doesn't actually go very far when you've basically crashed your systems and can no longer serve your customers. Because the other thing to remember, airlines is, I don't want to belittle people taking really major flights to, funerals and things like that. But basically, airlines, you can live with a travel disruption. We all know that. But we had banks going down, we had hospitals going down, and we had 911 systems going down. That is not okay. And, if you're not willing to do the right thing, not the popular thing, when your systems are really mission critical, that may not be so good. And downstream, the regulatory agencies might not be so happy with you.
So obviously, Linux folks have been talking about this for years. Do you think there's an opportunity for Apple to start making a play for enterprise customers again? Because it seems like it's essentially sort of just left the field and decided to focus all in on consumers.
I don't. I think there's the opportunity, but I don't think Apple has the slightest desire to do it. I think what we're more likely to see is reversion to things like, basically terminal to host servers, which didn't have this problem, or at least were much more fixable, because that was actually one of the great advantages of using terminals. And when the host is now the cloud, that actually can become much more viable. Although I will point out that at the same time there was a cloud failure, so which is
pick your poison.
Pick your poison, right? I think it's long past time for a new architecture to arrive that may not be Apple, may not be Unix, may not be Windows, but certainly takes into consideration the fact that when there's an outage like this, we're no longer talking about a couple of accountants whose books are running a couple days late. We're talking about people who die because they can't call 911, and that's a big difference. So
maybe this will finally be the year of the virtual desktop.
Oh yeah, it's what's it been, Drew? 20 years now?
It's coming. It's
coming next year.
If there ever was an opportunity, this was it. Right. All right, let's move on. A Securities and Exchange Commission lawsuit against SolarWinds has been mostly dismissed by a judge in a U.S. district court. This is a little complicated, so bear with us, but it is interesting. The SEC has accused SolarWinds of misleading investors about the company's security practices and of understating security risks both before and after the company's Orion software was compromised by Russian malware. The judge in this case has dismissed the SEC claims for statements made by SolarWinds after the attack, as well as for most of the company's claims about cybersecurity predating the attack. That said, the judge did not dismiss one SEC claim that SolarWinds' online security statement about its products, which were made before the attack, is, quote, viably pled as materially false and misleading in numerous respects. SolarWinds put up this security statement on its website. It made broad claims about the company's cybersecurity practices, including things like that SolarWinds complied with the NIST cybersecurity framework, that it used a secure development lifecycle, that it monitored its network, it had strong password protections, and maintained good access controls. And if you read through the ruling from the judge, the SEC has come with the receipts that, in fact, SolarWinds was not doing a lot of this, despite the fact that SolarWinds was referencing the security statement in press releases and public presentations and podcasts, and actually used the security statement as its official response to customer questionnaires about the company's cybersecurity practices. So I think this aspect of the SEC's lawsuit against SolarWinds is ongoing, but a lot of the rest of the case is being thrown out.
Yeah, and I think this is a very interesting one because it sort of highlights the fact that you really need to be doing what you say you do. But I would also highlight the fact that it's really difficult to do what you say you do. In other words, you know, one of the things that leapt out at me was it's not really possible to comply with the NIST cybersecurity framework. There's no such thing as saying, I am NIST cybersecurity compliant. There is, I follow the framework. I use it to set up everything that I do, but that it's very, very fuzzy because it is in fact a framework. It doesn't say you need to set this bit here over there. And if this bit isn't set, you're not in compliance. It just says take this approach to thinking about cybersecurity. And on top of things, as we discussed in a previous show, the cybersecurity framework is constantly changing and evolving. So, you know, I think the password thing is a little bit more realistic. I think you highlighted that because, you know, if you're using weak passwords and not really updating them, I think you said SolarWinds executives had admitted that they were not doing things like pen testing and security testing and not following the password policies. Yep. My concern, though, even with pen testing and security testing, is how much is enough. If you do it once, you could arguably say, I do it. But that's obviously not best practice. And I think this gets back to what I said earlier, which is doing what everybody else does doesn't necessarily protect you. Because, for example, in our space, people claim that they're doing tabletop exercises, and they claim that they're doing tabletop exercises regularly. Usually that means once a year. Our contention is that's not nearly close enough, often enough. And in fact, the top-notch cybersecurity organizations we work with tend to do it about 6 times a year, i.e. every 2 months. And they've constantly got a tabletop exercise in progress, being assessed or being launched. And, you know, is that what you have to do? I can't stand here and say that's what you have to do, but this is an example of doing what everybody else does doesn't necessarily, you know, protect you.
Well, there's 2 things at work here. One is, you know, was SolarWinds following quote unquote industry best practices? I think that's clearly up for debate that they were. The more important thing, though, from the SEC's perspective is SolarWinds was telling everybody they were, and they have some evidence, some pretty damning evidence that in fact they weren't, particularly with regard to things like their access control practices, their password policies, and some gaps in what they were claiming to be secure software development lifecycle. I think what's interesting is the SEC, this feels like a novel approach of the SEC, looking at security as something material to investors. You know, the SEC frankly is supposed to focus on financial crimes, and the fact that they're getting into cybersecurity as potentially material to, you know, your financial well-being, I think says a lot about what's coming for other companies in the industry.
Well, that was the big thing from last year, was that, you know, you now have to make these disclosures. Exactly. And the SEC has been very clear about this. I still will push back that it's a very you can kind of look at something and say, well, they did or didn't follow industry best practices. But again, there's no Bible of industry best practices. Even the NIST framework is not as clear as people like to pretend it is. So what's interesting is that they're putting companies, and correctly in this case, a cybersecurity company, but going forward, maybe companies who are banks or not cybersecurity companies, in the hot seat for following kind of fuzzy guidelines. And what's even more interesting is if you're a CISO at a non-cybersecurity company, you too could get hit with all of this, and you could potentially even end up in jail if you haven't done all the right things, with the asterisk that nobody really knows what the right things are, and we're just sort of guessing at this point.
Yes, but don't tell people you're doing things if you aren't. That's the big takeaway.
That is correct, but it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because if you stand up and say, no, we're actually not doing what everybody else says because we don't think it makes sense, that's not going to help you either. So I think this is going to be a much bigger issue in years to come. So watch this space. But I think, Drew, your main point is don't lie. That's always good advice. Whether you got it from mom in kindergarten or from the SEC today, don't lie.
Yeah, we're not lawyers, but I think it's probably safe to say don't lie is good legal advice.
Well, and moving on to yet another security story, AT&T acknowledges a big breach last year in 2023 that affected data of 109 million accounts. This was through the use of Snowflake. They announced a couple of weeks ago that a large data set was copied in 2023 by unauthorized parties. The data set included partial metadata on these accounts, mostly connected between May and October 2022. Again, metadata is not the contents of your texts or phone calls. It's what numbers you called or texted and what other numbers called or texted them. It did not include things like people's names or other PII or even text sending times or call start times or duration. So it was really a partial set. I think the big issue here is that even big companies are getting hit by this. And I think the thing to keep in mind is all three of these cybersecurity stories have to do with third-party risk in different perspectives. So, for example, AT&T's breach came from using Snowflake. Microsoft is blaming CrowdStrike, and SolarWinds was the third party that created a breach for everyone else.
Right.
So this is something that I think CISOs and board members and senior executives haven't thought enough about. How do you look both upstream and downstream in terms of ensuring that you are safe from that the vendors that you're using are safe, and then that you are not passing on vulnerabilities to your customers? I don't think that's been a solved problem. In fact, I was just last week working with an organization that has that front and center in what it's working on. But from an IT perspective, you should really be thinking about third-party risk and looking both upstream and downstream, because you will be liable in many cases for both.
Yeah, it's frankly a very difficult position to be in because it's hard enough to secure your own organization. And then if you have to account for third-party risk as well, that's just, I think, a lot on a CISO's plate.
Absolutely. Yes, it's a lot. And there's more to be said about this, because I'm not sure right now that the current organizational structure of having a CISO is really the right way to go about things. But we'll talk about that in an upcoming show.
We cover a lot of these breach announcements here on Network Break and also on the Packet Protector podcast. And frankly, I have to admit sometimes to feeling a little bit numbed because the breaches keep happening, the numbers keep getting bigger, and it seems like there are no repercussions. Consumers don't have a lot of repercussion other than, sort of a class action lawsuit, and they get maybe 15 cents out of it. So there's a little bit of punishment there because, large companies end up having to pay some money, but it doesn't seem like it's having an effect on security. So it just sort of feels like, okay, chalk up another one and nothing will change. Is that too bleak of an assessment?
I don't think so, because I think we're actually on the sea change of really rethinking of how we think about cybersecurity. And one of the things that I've raised numerous times in my advisories and with clients is that it may be past time to think about the concept of a chief risk operations officer. In other words, not a chief risk officer whose job it is to assess risk, but somebody who has the power and the budget to take steps to mitigate risk. And that person is the person that should be going to jail, not the CISO, because guess what? Although cybersecurity risk is a real thing, it's a big thing, as we've seen, it's not the only risk out there that companies face. And so that should be rolling up into a very senior level person whose job it is to decide, okay, are we going to spend $10 million on fortifying our buildings against the next COVID, or are we going to spend $10 million on cybersecurity? Mm-hmm. And those kinds of decisions really have to be made at the corporate level. You can't dump it all on the CISO.
Right. Okay, so you're proposing essentially the chief sacrificial lamb position.
Not really. I'm proposing somebody that actually has the power and authority to go with the kinds of decisions that need to be made. We have a chief sacrificial lamb. That's the CISO. But this whole idea of slaughtering the lamb to appease the gods has gone away because, if you're one of those people who died because 911 didn't work, I really don't care if you fired your CISO. You should not have been using Microsoft. You should not have been whatever. The point is, we need somebody whose job it is to make a reasonable assessment of risk, cybersecurity and otherwise, who can make that assessment transparent to shareholders and to customers, and can show you exactly the logical chain that led to decisions like we're going to spend 10 million here and not there.
That's true. I guess the caveats of having the budget and the power to actually make changes, I think, where the issue is.
Exactly. And I think the bigger thing is you want this person to be above cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is, while a very important risk, it's not the only one.
All right. As always, links in the show notes. Quick break to tell you about our sponsor. It's Nokia. Why should you care about the network OS running in your data center? Nokia designed SR Linux to support automation, orchestration, and customization. In a recent Tech Bytes podcast, we dug into SR Linux support for Yang and GNMI and how that support ties into northbound orchestration platforms. We also discussed how SR Linux provides streaming telemetry and Nokia's development kit that let you customize this Linux-based network OS. You can find that Tech Bytes in the show notes that accompany this episode, or just search packetpushers.net. You can also get more details for yourself at learn.srlinux.dev. That's learn.srlinux.dev.
Okay. And switching gears here, we're going to talk about the other hot topic of the moment, which is AI. Juniper's Ops for AI aims for AI improved networking and improved networks for AI. So Juniper just recently announced Ops for AI, which is kind of two pieces. And both Drew and I looked at this from slightly different angles. One piece is a loose collection of enhancements to existing products, all focused around AI. At the network level, Juniper is enhancing its remote direct memory access over IPv6 and v4 unconverged Ethernet, and then using AI for a whole bunch of things like improving network load balancing, congestion management, telemetry, and all of those fun things. This is important to us because that is actually one of the few solid use cases for AI, which is improving network operations or improving infrastructure operations overall. We've seen a lot of organizations get some real benefits by deploying AI in those scenarios. So it's interesting that Juniper stepped up and announced this. But that wasn't really the only thing they announced, right, Drew?
Yeah, the big takeaway for me is that as part of this initiative, they have put out a new lab where customers and would-be customers and partners can test and validate data center infrastructure for AI workloads. In particular, of course, Juniper wants to promote the use of Ethernet fabrics to support use cases like training AI models. The lab, called Ops for AI, is intended to, quote, give customers the confidence to deploy open and flexible AI infrastructure quickly yet effectively. So as we know, there's sort of a gold rush here of folks wanting to develop AI models, and you need infrastructure for that. And part of that infrastructure for the network fabric could be typically is InfiniBand. The Ethernet industry is making a huge push to sort of like jam Ethernet in there as being useful for these AI fabrics, but AI workloads have some unique issues. They're very sensitive to latency. Dropping packets is bad for AI. And so you've got to have essentially a lossless fabric, which Ethernet was not designed to be. So things like RDMA are being put in place across these networks to help make Ethernet more suited. And of course, all the Ethernet switch vendors want you to buy their switches, and Juniper is one of them. So they've decided to put a lab in their Sunnyvale campus. If you're thinking about building some AI infrastructure on-prem and you want to sort of test things out, Juniper will welcome you into the lab.
Yeah, and some of the other partners include NVIDIA, Intel, VAST, and Broadcom. What's interesting, of course, is there are no other networking vendors. What a surprise.
That's right.
That said, Juniper said that if a major customer engagement requires third-party networking and gear, they will accommodate it. You know, I know, Drew, you think this is kind of just another vendor looking to spur customer investment in AI. Is that kind of your take on this?
Yeah, my take is that all the switch vendors see a potential opportunity here because there's so much hype around AI that they could maybe sell a few more switches to enterprises who also are feeling that hype and thinking, we need an AI initiative. Let's build something and see what happens. So the other thing is that with this lab, it feels like to me it's kind of a sign that Gen AI in particular, LLMs, is a solution kind of looking for a problem. Like, yes, it can write you a term paper, but there's no real business killer app yet that I feel like has emerged for Gen AI. So
yeah, that's where I'll push back a little bit, because one of the things we've been seeing for over a year now is that enterprises have been using Gen AI in infrastructure optimization, infrastructure management, and actually seeing real benefits there. So as I said, this is one of the few sort of, I won't say proven, because there's no such thing as a single proven use case, but one of the few use cases that actually makes sense to explore. It's not sexy. It's not, it's not a chatbot. It's not creating robots, but it actually making your infrastructure run well is kind of a good thing, as we saw from some of the previous announcements.
Yeah, for sure. If you can find a way to use AI to help, analyze, organize, correlate all of the data you're collecting about your network, all that telemetry, and make something useful out of it and help you run operations better, that's 100% great use case. I don't know that LLMs are the way to do that, but that's, I guess, an argument for a different show.
I would say so.
Okay. Sticking with AI, the chipmaker AMD is acquiring an AI startup in Finland called Silo AI. AMD isn't buying hardware or a chipmaker or fabrication capabilities. Silo AI is, in fact, a lab made up of engineers and data scientists who develop and tailor AI models, platforms, and integrations for customers. AMD is paying $665 million in an all-cash deal for the lab.
Well, and I think that actually makes sense because right now there is a crying gap in the market of people who actually truly understand AI as opposed to the folks who say they do. Now, all of us who've studied engineering in the past 30 or 40 years are actually familiar with AI and have been keeping an eye on it because that was mandatory back in computer science curricula back in the 80s and 90s. But we're talking about people who are really in the process of developing and tailoring models, platforms, and integrations. And Drew, I think one of your suspicions is that AMD is trying to spur the market for hardware by having a service or advisory arm that helps customers find use cases for AI and integrate it into their businesses. Is that kind of your take?
Yeah, absolutely. AMD is sort of right now getting its butt kicked in the GPU space by NVIDIA. So it needs to make investments to get people onto the NVIDIA platform, the AMD platform.
Yeah.
And one of the ways to do that is to have a bunch of data scientists at your command who can be like, hey, we've got some great ideas for your business where you could use AI to help you do X, Y, Z. Let's build some infrastructure. Oh, and it happens to be using AMD GPUs, but that doesn't really matter because what's more important is the outcome.
Yeah, I think that may be the case. I think also just having those the skill sets internally is super helpful because you can't just like snap your fingers and hire a bunch of those folks. One of the things I thought was funny is Silo AI built a business around training LLMs in European languages, particularly the Nordic languages.
Yes.
Just for the record, although Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are fairly straightforward languages, I speak Norwegian. Ja, jeg snakker norsk, jeg. But I would say Icelandic and particularly Finnish are diabolical languages. So I think it's great to have an LLM that actually understands those languages because God knows the rest of us don't.
I'm all for it. I also think AMD is kind of taking a page from NVIDIA in the sense that obviously NVIDIA sells GPUs, but it also sells AI software to help developers and data scientists build applications on top of that NVIDIA hardware. So AMD again is like, yeah, we got to find ways to help customers decide to get onto the AMD platform. And so we now got a lab to help them do that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Well, moving right along to boring old traditional conventional infrastructure, like nothing about AI, nothing about cybersecurity. HPE has added Edge Connect integration to Microsoft's SSE. So HPE's Aruba Edge Connect SD-WAN virtual appliance can now be integrated with Microsoft's Entra Internet Access, which is part of Microsoft's Microsoft 365 focused SSE platform, which creates a hybrid SASE solution. Yay. That means that M365 traffic is getting routed through Entra while other traffic goes to HPE's own SSE services or any other SSE that Edge Connect integrates with. This is the first SD-WAN solution for which Microsoft has validated integration with Entra. So that's, I guess, a win for HPE. And it's kind of interesting that you're sort of taking M365 on one path and all other traffic on another, which is actually something that we've seen enterprises do for a while now. It's just been a whole lot more manual than it can be now. What are your thoughts, Drew?
Yeah, it's a totally sensible tie-up. I think HPE has a pretty good SD-WAN product. Obviously, Microsoft has the Entra Internet Access, and SD-WAN is very good at letting you do that kind of fine-grained traffic steering. So if you want to use the Entra Internet Access, you can send all your Microsoft 365 traffic to that. If you have a different SSE that you like for other things, or you want to send it back to your own cluster of security appliances, you can do that. SD-WAN is very good at splitting up this traffic based on traffic type and use. So it makes perfect sense. I think it's one of those very happy press release announcements for both companies.
Yeah, and it's I would say boring, but actually very useful for quite a lot of the folks that listen to this show. So make note.
Absolutely. Yeah, we got to cover the basic stuff too. That does wrap up the news portion of our show. As always, thank you for listening. Please do stay tuned for our sponsored Tech Bytes conversation with Palo Alto Networks on vulnerability management for IoT and OT devices. That's coming right up. Today on the Tech Bytes podcast, we discuss vulnerability management for IoT and OT devices with sponsor Palo Alto Networks. These devices, so think video cameras, sensors, medical equipment, industrial control systems, and so on, present unique challenges when it comes to finding, prioritizing, and managing software vulnerabilities. Our guest from Palo Alto Networks is Kalyan Saddam, Director of Product Management. Kalyan, welcome to the podcast. Let's sort of jump in and review why IoT and OT devices are a separate category from computers and phones when we're thinking about vulnerability management.
Yes, IoT and OT devices are certainly different category than IT devices. These devices are everywhere and come with multiple different names, cyber physical systems, industrial control, medical IoT, OT, IoT, and so on, right?
Mhm.
And we come across these devices everywhere. Many of us have them at our home. They are on the road as you're driving to work, in the office buildings, classrooms, hospitals, critical infrastructure, and so on, right? These devices are built for a specific function and they are not necessarily built with security at heart. And increasingly, because of their presence everywhere, malicious actors are looking to essentially exploit them and cause havoc or just use those devices as a way to get into customers' networks, right? That's
Mhm.
why
Yep.
their posture, you certainly need a different type of approach to be able to kind of go about securing this.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is they need to be on the network, but you also can't control them the way you would a traditional IT device, with some kind of agent software to put protection right on the device itself.
That's right. Yeah, you cannot install an agent software. You cannot do a typical type of scans that you would traditionally do in a vulnerability management. If you try to do them, they could sometimes even crash and or get stuck.
So you mean if I want to run a traditional vulnerability scanner, I could actually take out my IoT devices?
Absolutely. Imagine if you are an operator in a critical infrastructure or in a healthcare delivery organization and somebody tried to scan these devices and they are actually providing some useful function, providing patient care. You don't certainly want to do that type of things, right?
Okay, so then the question is, how do I address this issue if all the equipment, the tools, the process that I'm using traditionally to identify and address vulnerabilities, maybe I can't do with these IoT and OT devices?
Yeah, so we certainly have a different approach to securing these devices. Palo Alto Networks have a solution, and as well as in the industry, offering a more of a passive-based solution where we can identify these devices down to their make and model and software versions that are running on them, and use that knowledge to identify what type of vulnerabilities exist on these devices. And then you need to think about or finding ways to offering a security on these devices from a network point of view. And there are many few approaches where we can offer in terms of some of the things that you could potentially do is you could find the vulnerabilities passively discovered, and then you could think about how you may, let's say, a vulnerability is applicable only for a specific type of application or a specific configuration that you have on the device. You may go about actually changing the configuration if you can disable certain application to avoid that vulnerability being present or could be exploited otherwise, right? You could do that.
So you're saying if there's a particular vulnerability and maybe there's not a patch available, I could use essentially the network to say, okay, I know the vulnerability has to come through, this port, this protocol combination. So make sure that doesn't happen. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. And sometimes you may not be able to disable an application on the device or change configuration on the device to avoid that vulnerability. Then that's where a network-based security solution like what we offer with Palo Alto could come in handy to block those threats to come in to the network. Or you can even think about leveraging other solutions like intrusion detection and prevention technologies that you may have to be able to go about actually having a type of a virtual patch to address those specific vulnerabilities.
I think it's also too important to probably highlight that a lot of IoT are small devices, but there's a large number of them. And the idea that you can rectify by replacing or rotating or patching these IoTs like door locks, temperature sensors, it's as a category, they're extremely difficult to update or patch or fix. They're not, they're often not software operated, if you know what I mean. So
right, yes.
Even if you find a vulnerability, in a brand of thing that's in your ceiling, checking that the lights are on, there's a light sensor. The chances that someone's going to come out and patch that in the next 3 months is almost zero.
That's exactly right. That's again kind of plays into the one of the key aspect of these devices, right? In terms of how many of these devices exist, and there's also an aspect of how these devices are being used in an organization can play a huge role. Some of these devices, as Greg, you're saying, could be a simple doorknob or could be a controller on a mission critical furnace that's operating and producing a manufacturing plant, right?
Or a heart monitor in a hospital is the classic, right? And
Exactly.
you can't just update the code. You have to, bring in certified individuals with insurance cover and, oh my goodness, and you can't just say, I don't have these devices sometimes.
That's right. The sheer volume of them and the ability to be able to even humanly possibly to update them is simply not possible. And that's where you need kind of an aspect of different type of different way to even look at them. For example, I talked about, finding a network-based solution, right? That's something that we could think about. There were customers I spoke with. This customer specifically that comes to my mind is operates a huge wind farm, offshore wind farms in Europe. And for them, they only get a few minutes of downtime in a year, right? They are really rushing to perform typical maintenance activities that required to make sure that devices can operate. Now, if you were to schedule patching on top of it, you're likely looking at extended waiting period before you can even get to thinking about patching, even if it's really possible to do so.
That's right. So really it has to be in-network mitigation or edge mitigation for these types of devices.
That's right. Exactly. And the sheer volume of these devices that you have and the vulnerabilities that are affecting them, you obviously need to have a different way to prioritize them, right? Some of these devices could be simply a business enabler. Let's say if you're a mission critical operator, those devices could be so severe that you cannot afford to lose them. But in a typical organization, if you have a printer or a camera or a doorknob sensor, they are just an enabler. It's not mission critical for your day-to-day operating, and they're not necessarily tied to your business or revenue outcome that you're producing, right? So hence you need to have a different type of prioritization in terms of how you go about even securing or patching these vulnerabilities that exist.
I think what you're drawing a bow at there is this idea that customers' use cases are diverse. IoT devices can be mission critical or they can be trivial. They can be life critical in the case of medical. But your reaction to them has to vary according to the situation. In some cases, you need to either rush out and fix the problem at source, get someone in, patch the devices, or you have to say, this is a fact of life and I have to have some methodology to just handle this. I have to assume these devices are almost compromised all the time and have a way to cope with anything that comes up, to react to the situation rather than fix the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's you summarize it very well, Greg. One of the thing, when we think about vulnerabilities, we may be thinking about these devices having software vulnerabilities, but sometimes it could be simple configuration things like, hey, you have a default password still on the device. You may need to go and change them, or you just need to disable certain configuration to have them secure, right? Even recently, there was a ruling that got passed, I think first time in the world, UK government happened to be banning any devices that have default passwords that are out on the network, to have essentially manufacturers not to allow the devices to be deployed without changing those default passwords, right? That's one simple aspect of it. Now, when it comes to prioritization of these devices and the vulnerabilities that are associated with them, you cannot use the same approach for all these devices for the facts that we just talked about in terms of, can you patch them? Is it, first of all, humanly possible to patch all these hundreds of devices? At what time frame? What type of resources you need and all that. So with that, you need a different type of prioritization approach, right? Which takes into consideration of not only the CVE and the severity of the CVE that exists on these devices, but also a method of understanding, hey, how business critical this device is in terms of is this device something like a CFO laptop versus a regular junior engineer or an intern's laptop, right? That type of thinking needs to come into these devices where you're understanding the asset criticality as one of the big factor, how likely or exploitability nature of this vulnerability itself need to be taken into effect in terms of what type of attack vector it is. Is this vulnerability known to be exploited in the wild? Who are the state actors that may be going after these vulnerabilities? Should that device get compromised, what type of business impact you may have, and what type of blast radius that device could provide in terms of, let's say, we talked about fish tank thermometer being leveraged to get into a casino last.
Yeah. That's also related to other topics we've talked to you before about, like microsegmentation and reducing the ability to move laterally. A fish tank should not have access to your data center, fish tank monitor, right? So
Absolutely, yeah. That understanding of the blast radius also could be taken into consideration, and what type of mitigating effects you may have already in place to kind of either you have already segmented the device out or the blast radius has been contained because of other type of mitigative actions that you may have to be able to kind of understand and use that as a way to prioritize.
So I think what you're saying is don't just let the, a high CVE number sort of impact your thinking. There's got to be other considerations you take into account, like how important this is to the business, the blast radius, and so on. It's not just about that high CVE number.
That's absolutely right. And a lot of times customers typically don't have that type of framework in place. We are basically providing or encouraging customers to find that type of information at their fingertips to be able to kind of give that easy to prioritize, especially when you're thinking about hundreds and thousands of these IoT, OT devices in any typical organization.
So are there other considerations that you would recommend folks take into account for managing vulnerabilities in their IoT and OT space?
Yeah, I think if I were to just kind of go at a high level, typical would be to say, hey, given the knowledge of this vulnerability exists, what could be done on the device to kind of disable that vulnerability in terms of changing configuration on the device, if it is possible to effectively reduce or eliminate that hack surface or that vulnerability. Thinking about understanding, implementing some zero trust policies that only allow the trusted behaviors to say, hey, any unnecessary communication has been now removed by implementing zero trust policies as a way to kind of contain that. Then you can also think about and take into consideration of, hey, if this exploit is only to be launched through the internet or through other network connectivity, how could you limit that type of access as well, along with the zero trust policies could be one other factor. And finally, given, all these options available, sometimes you may not be even, let's say, disable the application that's vulnerable, or you have to allow certain applications to be communicating because that's required for that device to function. Then there are other mechanisms that we can offer in terms of looking at other security subscriptions, like options of intrusion detection and prevention, or any DNS URL protection, or ability to detect any binary downloads if the exploit were to be sent through a binary to the device. You can think about applying all these different dimensions of security controls organizations may have to be able to kind of provide that additional level of protection. Or you can also think about this as virtual patching as a way to manage these vulnerabilities, especially, given that sometimes you cannot even go about patching these devices easily.
Right. So it sounds like maybe the first step then is actually device discovery and classification. Yes, is that, and where does Palo Alto come into the picture there?
Yes, that's great. Actually, you're right. The key mantra in security is you need to have visibility to everything that you want to go about securing that, right? So Palo Alto IoT and OT security solutions that we offer in the market today provide a passive mechanism to discover these devices using machine learning based technologies to identify not only the device type, but down to the make and model and the software versions that are potentially running on these devices as a way to kind of provide the visibility. And then you don't actually need to deploy any dedicated sensor of sort, which is kind of key requirement in other solutions in the market. But given this solution, IoT, OT security is offered right on our firewall platforms, customers are able to leverage those firewall devices as a sensor in addition to being a security enforcement and prevention function, right? That's something that we offer as a unique offer to help our customers with IoT, OT devices to go about securing them.
Because the firewall is seeing traffic come through it, it's able to look at that traffic to do the device identity?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the way we do that is our firewall is have our industry is known for being the next generation firewall. We have DPI capabilities to identify what applications are running. The same exact DPI engine has been enhanced to provide that next level of metadata collection to help us identify these IoT devices and as well as any behaviors that could potentially be anomalous, right? To identify and then detect and notify our customers. And given we are a firewall platform, we also have continuous trust verification in the platform itself in the form of not only anomaly detection, but also inspecting all the traffic and identifying any threats using advanced security services like threat prevention, URL protection, sandboxing using wildfire and such.
Okay, so this is potentially being able to intercept an attack that might be targeting a vulnerable IoT device.
That's exactly right. So using all these capabilities on our solution, we can not only provide visibility to the devices and the risk and vulnerabilities that are lurking on those devices, you're able to actually apply security controls by only limiting to trusted behaviors that you want to enable, and as well as applying all the security protections on them by blocking essentially any intrusions that are trying to get into the network through these IoT and OT devices. What we have done is that to help our customers, we have introduced recently a risk prioritization framework within our platform that essentially allows our customers to eliminate more than 70% of the CVE noise that's otherwise is there. Because essentially not every single IoT device is necessarily equal from a business risk point of view. We take the device criticality into consideration and all the other potential mitigative actions that you have already put in place are available within our platform in the form of intrusion prevention to help customers to prioritize to the ones that they really need to focus. And that essentially eliminates more than 70% of the CVE noise.
Well, we are at the end of our time. If folks are looking to address their IoT and OT needs and curious about what Palo Alto might be able to help with, where should they go?
Yeah, so we offer several hands-on workshops for our customers. So customers can find these workshops both on the internet and the show notes today, and you can sign up and get your hands-on in a very controlled environment where you can look at the solution, or you can better yet, take the solution for a free trial in your own environment to discover not only all your IoT OT devices, but also all the vulnerabilities that are impacting your specific network, and see how we can help you prioritize and reduce your attack surface and protect those devices as well.
Okay, yeah, so we'll have the links to that free trial if you want to try it out for yourself, and also links to the various hands-on workshops that you can register for, including an IoT security hands-on workshop, a medical IoT security hands-on workshop, and an industrial OT security hands-on workshop. Well, thank you, Caitlin, for joining us, and thanks to Palo Alto Networks for being a sponsor. And thanks to you for being a listener. We appreciate your time and attention. You can find more of these technical podcasts and our community blog. It's all at packetpushers.net. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can hear us on Spotify. And if you would, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.